5 trips, 5 moments that were supposed to be unforgettable for the right reasons. A family adventure that began as a delayed honeymoon dream, a quiet sunset drive on an open safari vehicle, a river excursion that looked calm enough to feel safe, a guided walk that promised authentic content, and a mountain forest trek built around one simple rule: keep your distance. In each case, the rules were explicit. In each case, someone broke them, and in each case, what followed happened faster than anyone was ready for. On July 14, 2018, under a pale winter sun in a remote wildlife reserve in southern Africa, a self-guided safari vehicle moved slowly across open savanna, its tires following the edge of a marked track that cut through tall grass and scattered acacia. The landscape was quiet in the way protected wilderness often is, expansive and deceptively calm, with visibility stretching for hundreds of meters. For visitors, the reserve represented controlled access to one of the world's most powerful ecosystems, a place where proximity to apex predators was permitted only under clearly defined conditions designed to prevent predictable outcomes. Inside the vehicle were Daniel Carter, age 41, his wife Laura, age 38, and their 2 children, both under the age of 12. The family had traveled from the United States, where Daniel worked as a senior project manager for a multinational technology firm. The safari marked the final leg of a trip that had begun as a delayed honeymoon dream and evolved into a broader family adventure. Daniel was known among friends and colleagues as meticulous and driven, someone accustomed to documentation, schedules, and measurable results. This trip, he later told relatives, was meant to be unforgettable, carefully recorded through photographs and video. Before entering the reserve, Daniel and Laura attended a mandatory orientation session, a procedural briefing delivered to all visitors participating in self-guided drives. Rangers outlined strict safety guidelines in plain, unambiguous language. Guests were instructed to remain seated inside their vehicles at all times, to keep windows closed when near wildlife, and to maintain distance measured in tens of meters from large animals. They were warned to stay on designated roads, never to pursue animals, and to follow instructions immediately if predators approached or blocked a route. The rules were framed not as suggestions, but as conditions of entry developed through decades of incident analysis and wildlife behavior research. The orientation emphasized that lions within the reserve were not habituated to human presence in the way animals near lodges sometimes are. They were free-ranging apex predators whose responses were shaped by instinct, not familiarity. Rangers explained that even momentary violations of protocol could trigger defensive or predatory behavior, especially when cubs were present. Visitors acknowledged these explicit rules with signatures and verbal confirmation before receiving access permits and GPS-enabled radios for emergencies. For the first several hours of the drive, the Carter family followed these guidelines carefully. They moved slowly, stopping at designated pullouts to observe antelope and bird life from a safe distance. Daniel photographed through the windshield and side windows without opening them, narrating quietly for his children. The environment felt controlled, almost curated, and the absence of immediate danger began to reinforce a sense of confidence. This gradual complacency is a pattern frequently noted in wildlife tourism investigations, where early uneventful exposure leads visitors to reassess risk based on personal experience rather than established protocol. Shortly after midday, the family encountered a pride of lions resting in partial shade near a dry riverbed, approximately 200 meters from the track. Through binoculars, lionesses could be seen lying close together, with several cubs partially concealed in the grass. The vehicle stopped at a safe distance, initially estimated at 40 meters, consistent with the reserve's guidance. Other vehicles were not present, and the isolation contributed to a sense of exclusivity, of witnessing something rare and intimate. Daniel began photographing more intensely, adjusting angles and zoom, repositioning the vehicle slightly to improve his line of sight. Over time, he eased the car forward in short increments, closing the distance to roughly 20 meters. At this range, the lions remained still, their posture relaxed but alert. From an investigative standpoint, this lack of immediate reaction is often misinterpreted by visitors as tolerance, when in fact it reflects energy conservation and situational assessment by apex predators. Wildlife authorities later explained that a pride of lions, particularly when cubs are present, operates under a hierarchy of protective behavior. Lionesses are responsible for defense, and movement within a perceived threat radius can rapidly alter their response. The animal's stillness should have been read as vigilance, not acceptance. The orientation materials explicitly warned that remaining seated and stationary was critical to avoiding escalation. Despite this, Daniel drove off the marked road to gain a clearer view, compressing the grass beneath the tires and reducing the distance to approximately 10 meters. He opened the driver's side window to remove glare, creating an additional breach of protocol. Laura reportedly expressed concern, reminding him of the rules they had reviewed that morning. Daniel, focused on framing what he believed would be the defining images of the trip, reassured her that they would leave soon. Moments later, the vehicle's rear tires sank into a patch of unstable ground, softened by earlier rains. The car lurched and stalled, immobilized. This mechanical complication marked the transition from risk accumulation to critical exposure. According to investigation findings, the family remained inside the vehicle for nearly a minute as Daniel attempted to restart the engine. During this time, at least one lioness stood and oriented toward the car, closing several meters of distance. Against all explicit instructions, Daniel exited the vehicle to assess the situation, stepping onto the ground between the car and the lions. This single reckless decision represented the fatal photo opportunity's culmination, a violation of every safety principle outlined during orientation. From an animal behavior perspective, the sudden appearance of a human figure at ground level within close proximity constituted an immediate threat. The response was rapid. The pride moved as a coordinated unit, lionesses advancing with speed measured in seconds rather than minutes. Laura exited the vehicle moments later, likely attempting to intervene or retreat. The children remained inside, as instructed, crouched low in the back seat. Within a very short time frame, both adults sustained fatal injuries and did not survive the encounter. The escalation, while brief, was decisive, illustrating the predictable consequences of violating protocols in the presence of apex predators. Inside the vehicle, the children were physically unharmed. They remained silent and still for several minutes after the incident, a period later reconstructed through GPS data and radio logs. At approximately 3 minutes post-incident, the Reserve's Monitoring Center detected the stationary vehicle through its tracking system. When no radio check-in followed, rangers were dispatched to the GPS coordinates. The ranger response began within 5 minutes. A patrol vehicle reached the site shortly thereafter, using sirens and engine noise to disperse the lions. Medical responders attempted life-saving measures, but both adults were pronounced deceased at the scene. Given the severity of the situation and the presence of wildlife, a medical evacuation was deemed unnecessary for the adults. The children were removed from the vehicle and transported to a secure facility for evaluation and care. In the hours that followed, authorities sealed off the area and initiated a formal investigation. Statements were collected, vehicle telemetry reviewed, and orientation records examined. The lions involved were not destroyed, as the investigation determined their behavior fell entirely within natural parameters. The Reserve's final report concluded that the incident was the result of human error and tourist error, citing multiple violated protocols, including off-road driving, failure to maintain distance, opening windows, and exiting the vehicle. The investigation determined that the outcome was entirely preventable. No equipment failure or ranger negligence contributed to the event. The Reserve issued a public statement emphasizing that wildlife rules exist to protect both visitors and animals, and that deviations, even brief ones, can produce irreversible consequences. In the months following, additional signage was installed and self-guided access zones were reduced, reflecting a systemic response to the lessons learned too late. For the surviving children, the experience marked a final moment that would shape their understanding of wilderness and risk. They were reunited with extended family and received ongoing psychological support. Their survival was attributed directly to their remaining seated inside the vehicle, adhering to the very instructions that had been ignored moments earlier. This incident stands as a sobering example among 3 tragic encounters documented by wildlife authorities during that period, each underscoring the same conclusion. Wild animals do not distinguish between intention and action, between curiosity and threat. Strict safety guidelines delivered through orientation and reinforced by explicit rules are not barriers to experience, but the conditions that make experience possible. When those rules are dismissed, the escalation is not random. It is predictable, swift, and often final. On August 22, 2016, as dusk settled over a private game reserve bordering the vast Serengeti ecosystem in northern Tanzania, the landscape shifted from the heat of late afternoon into the muted stillness that precedes night. The sky dimmed to a copper hue, and long shadows stretched across a dry riverbed where grasses thinned and the terrain opened into a natural corridor used by wildlife. At this hour, visibility begins to narrow, and animal movement often increases, a transitional window that reserve authorities classify as elevated risk for visitors. A small group of tourists sat aboard an open safari vehicle positioned on a designated track roughly parallel to the riverbed. Among them was a 62-year-old retired secondary school teacher from the United Kingdom, a man who had spent decades teaching geography and environmental studies. Friends later described him as patient, curious, and deeply respectful of the natural world. This journey, planned years in advance, represented a lifelong ambition to observe and photograph large African wildlife in their natural habitat. For him, the safari was not about thrill-seeking, but about completing a personal narrative shaped by education and wonder. Before entering the reserve earlier that day, the group participated in a mandatory orientation led by certified wildlife guides employed by the private concession. During this briefing, strict safety guidelines were explained in clear and deliberate terms. Guests were told to remain seated at all times while the vehicle was in proximity to animals, never to stand, lean, or extend any part of their body beyond the vehicle's profile. A minimum distance of 25 meters from large predators was emphasized, along with the instruction to follow instructions immediately if guides issued warnings or commands. These explicit rules were reinforced with examples drawn from past incidents, underscoring that they existed to prevent predictable and often irreversible outcomes. The guides explained that the open vehicles, while offering unobstructed views, relied entirely on adherence to protocol for safety. The animals encountered within the reserve were not restrained or conditioned to human presence. Lions, in particular, were described as apex predators with acute sensitivity to movement, silhouette, and perceived threat. Standing upright, the guides warned, fundamentally alters how an animal assesses risk. The orientation concluded with a reminder that dusk was a critical period when visibility decreases for humans but remains effective for predators. As the afternoon progressed, the safari unfolded without incident. The group observed antelope moving cautiously toward water and watched giraffes feeding at a distance measured safely in dozens of meters. The atmosphere inside the vehicle was calm, marked by quiet conversation and intermittent photography. Over time, the absence of immediate danger began to reshape the group's perception of risk. This gradual complacency, noted frequently in post-incident analyses, often arises when early compliance appears to yield safe and rewarding experiences. Shortly before sunset, the guide brought the vehicle to a controlled stop after spotting a pride of lions resting near the edge of the dry riverbed, approximately 30 meters away. Several lionesses lay partially concealed in the grass, while at least one adult male was visible farther back, his mane catching the last light of day. No cubs were immediately apparent, but the configuration suggested a resting pride, conserving energy before nighttime activity. The engine was turned off to reduce noise, and the guide quietly reminded the group of the rules. Remain seated, keep movements minimal, and allow the animals to dictate distance. Cameras were raised, shutters clicked softly, and for several minutes the scene remained unchanged. The lions appeared still, their posture relaxed but attentive. From a behavioral standpoint, such stillness is not passive acceptance, but a form of assessment, a moment in which predators evaluate their surroundings. As the light continued to fade, the retired teacher shifted in his seat, adjusting his camera. The diminishing brightness made photography more difficult, and the angle from his seated position limited his line of sight. According to later witness statements, he hesitated briefly before rising slightly from his seat to gain a clearer view, lifting his upper body above the vehicle's frame. The guide immediately issued a warning, instructing him to sit back down and reminding him of the explicit rules explained during orientation. For a few seconds, the man remained upright, focused on framing what he believed would be the defining image of his journey. This moment, driven by a desire to capture a final photograph before nightfall, became the single decisive, reckless decision. In investigative terms, it represented a clear instance of violated protocols, occurring despite prior instruction and immediate warning. From the perspective of the lions, the sudden elevated silhouette altered the situation instantly. Wildlife authorities later explained that an upright human figure at close range can be interpreted as a challenge or a potential threat, particularly in low-light conditions when depth perception is reduced. The pride responded within seconds. One lioness rose and advanced rapidly, closing the distance far faster than most humans anticipate possible. The escalation was swift and controlled in its description, but devastating in outcome. The guide restarted the engine and attempted to move the vehicle, but the reaction had already been triggered. Within moments, the tourists sustained fatal injuries and did not survive the encounter. Other passengers remained seated, as instructed, and were not physically harmed. The guide radioed for help immediately, transmitting GPS coordinates to the reserve's Central Operations Center within seconds of the incident. A ranger response was dispatched without delay, and additional vehicles converged on the location within minutes, using engine noise and positioning to draw the lions away. Medical responders attempted life-saving measures as soon as it was safe to do so, but the injuries proved unsurvivable. The reserve secured the area and initiated emergency protocols. The remaining tourists were escorted back to the lodge under ranger supervision, and counseling support was arranged. The body of the deceased was transported via medical evacuation to a regional facility, though no airlifted transfer was required due to the confirmed fatality at the scene. In the days that followed, authorities launched a formal investigation in accordance with Tanzanian wildlife tourism regulations. Investigators reviewed orientation materials, guide credentials, vehicle positioning, and eyewitness accounts. GPS data confirmed that the vehicle had maintained the required distance prior to the incident. Radio logs demonstrated that the guide issued immediate warnings and responded appropriately once the situation escalated. The investigation determined that the incident was entirely preventable. Authorities concluded that the lion's behavior was consistent with natural instinct and that no animal was acting abnormally or aggressively outside expected parameters. As a result, no lions from the pride were destroyed or relocated. The final report cited human error and tourist error as the sole contributing factors, emphasizing that the decisive factor was standing up in violation of clearly explained rules. In its closing statement, the reserve highlighted the predictable escalation that follows when safety protocols are ignored, particularly in environments shared with apex predators. Officials reiterated that similar principles apply across wildlife encounters globally, whether involving a pride of lions on open savanna, a Nile crocodile functioning as an ambush predator along a riverbank, or mountain gorillas responding defensively to a perceived challenge from a human approaching a silverback too closely. In each case, distance, posture, and compliance with guidance determine outcomes. For those who witnessed the event, the experience became a permanent reminder that wildlife tourism operates on conditional trust. The animals do not adapt to human expectations. Humans are expected to adapt to the animals. The retired teacher's journey, shaped by a lifelong respect for nature, ended in a final moment defined not by malice or recklessness in character, but by a brief lapse in judgment under fading light. This incident stands as a cautionary account of how quickly conditions can change when strict safety guidelines are set aside. The rules explained during orientation are not abstract constraints, but the accumulated knowledge of past incidents, learned too late by those who underestimated the speed and decisiveness of wild animals. In environments governed by instinct rather than intention, maintaining distance, remaining seated, and following instructions immediately are not optional behaviors. They are the difference between observation and tragedy, a distinction that becomes clear only after consequences unfold. Fardy and Sophie Mitchell, age 27, had arrived at the river 2 days earlier, still carrying the energy of a honeymoon dream that followed their wedding in the United Kingdom. Ryan worked as a civil engineering technician, Sophie as a marketing coordinator, and both shared a passion for travel shaped by curated experiences and photography. The canoe excursion had been marketed as a guided, low-risk introduction to river wildlife, an intimate way to observe birds, hippos at a distance, and the broader ecosystem from the waterline. For the couple, it was meant to be a quiet, memorable chapter of their first trip together as a married pair. Before launch, all participants attended a mandatory orientation conducted by a senior river guide with more than a decade of experience on that waterway. The briefing was procedural and direct. Strict safety guidelines were explained in detail, emphasizing that the canoes were stable only when occupants remained seated at all times. Guests were instructed to maintain distance from the riverbanks, where visibility was limited and crocodiles often rested motionless. The guide underscored explicit rules: no standing, no leaning, and no attempts to photograph wildlife while altering body position. The instruction to follow instructions immediately was repeated, particularly if a crocodile was sighted. The guide explained that the Nile crocodile is an ambush predator capable of explosive movement over very short distances. Unlike animals that rely on pursuit, crocodiles depend on stillness and surprise. A canoe, the guide noted, is perceived not as a vessel, but as an object within the animal's territory. Sudden shifts in balance or posture can trigger a response. Participants acknowledged the rules verbally before entering the water, and life vests were checked and secured. The excursion began smoothly. The group consisted of 3 canoes spaced several meters apart, moving downstream with the current at a controlled pace. For the first half hour, the experience matched expectations. Birds lifted from the reeds as the canoes passed, and the guide pointed out tracks along the mud, keeping the group centered in the channel and away from the banks. Ryan and Sophie sat facing forward, cameras resting in their laps, occasionally lifting them to take photographs while seated. As time passed without incident, the perceived risk began to soften. The river remained placid, and the guide's calm demeanor reinforced a sense of safety. This gradual complacency, common in outdoor incidents, often develops when environmental cues contradict verbal warnings. The absence of visible danger can encourage participants to reassess the rules as conservative rather than essential. Approximately 40 minutes into the journey, the guide slowed the group after spotting a large Nile crocodile basking on a low bank ahead, partially submerged, its outline visible at an estimated distance of 15 meters. The guide raised a hand, signaling the canoes to hold position and maintain distance. He reminded the group to remain seated and still, allowing the animals to dictate the interaction. From the crocodile's perspective, the scene was static. Its body was aligned with the bank, eyes just above the waterline, posture indicating rest but readiness. Wildlife authorities later explained that crocodiles in this state are not passive. Their sensory systems detect vibration and movement through water and air, and their reaction time can be nearly instantaneous when a perceived opportunity or threat emerges. Ryan lifted his camera, adjusting settings. The seated angle limited his view, and the vegetation along the bank obscured part of the animal's body. According to the guide's later statement, Ryan hesitated, then shifted his weight and rose to one knee, attempting to elevate his position for a clearer shot. Sophie reportedly reached toward him, but the movement had already begun. Standing in a canoe, even briefly, violated the explicit rules given during orientation. It altered the vessel's center of gravity and changed the silhouette presented to the crocodile. In investigative terms, this was the single decisive reckless decision, a fatal photo opportunity driven by proximity and the desire to capture a defining image. The canoe destabilized almost immediately. Within seconds, the narrow hull tipped and both occupants were thrown into the water. The guide radioed for help as soon as he saw the capsize, transmitting GPS coordinates while maneuvering his own canoe away from the bank. The crocodile responded with speed consistent with its role as an ambush predator, closing the distance in a matter of seconds. The escalation was rapid and overwhelming. Both Ryan and Sophie sustained fatal injuries and did not survive the encounter. Other canoes remained upright, their occupants frozen in place as instructed, minimizing additional triggers. The guide continued radio communication, providing updates while attempting to position himself to assist without further endangering the group. Ranger response was initiated immediately upon receipt of the distress call. A patrol boat departed from a downstream station within minutes, while additional personnel were mobilized along the river. By the time Rangers arrived, the incident had concluded. Medical responders attempted life-saving measures when it was safe to do so, but both victims were pronounced deceased at the scene. A medical evacuation was arranged to recover the bodies, and the remaining participants were escorted back to the launch site under Ranger supervision. No airlifted evacuation was required for survivors, though counseling services were made available. The area was temporarily closed to tourism activities pending investigation. In the days that followed, authorities conducted a comprehensive review. They examined orientation records, guide certifications, radio logs, and GPS data. The investigation determined that the guide had followed all established procedures, including maintaining appropriate distances, issuing clear instructions, and initiating emergency response protocols without delay. Authorities concluded that the guide was blameless. The final report identified human error and tourist error as the sole contributing factors. Standing in the canoe directly violated the safety guidelines designed to prevent exactly such outcomes. The crocodile's behavior was assessed as natural and consistent with species-specific instincts. No attempt was made to remove or destroy the animal as it was acting within its environment. In its public findings, the investigative panel emphasized that water-based wildlife encounters carry unique risks. Unlike terrestrial safaris where vehicles provide a physical barrier, canoes place humans directly within an animal's domain. The panel drew parallels to other wildlife interactions, noting that similar principles apply whether observing a pride of lions with lionesses and cubs from a vehicle, maintaining distance from mountain gorillas led by a dominant silverback, or navigating rivers inhabited by crocodiles. In each context, strict adherence to rules is the primary determinant of safety. For those who knew Ryan and Sophie, the loss reframed what had been intended as a celebration. Their final moment was defined not by recklessness and character, but by a brief departure from discipline under seemingly benign conditions. It was a lesson learned too late, one that underscores how quickly circumstances can shift when established boundaries are crossed. Wildlife authorities continue to stress that orientation briefings are not formalities. They are distilled from decades of data, each rule reflecting a previous incident, a response time measured in seconds, and outcomes that could not be reversed. To maintain distance, to remain seated, and to follow instructions immediately are not constraints on experience. They are the conditions that allow humans to share space with animals whose instincts are unchanged by tourism. Along that river, the water still moves quietly past the reeds, and crocodiles continue to rest along the banks as they have for millennia. The environment remains indifferent to intention or celebration. For visitors, the responsibility lies in recognizing that safety in wild places is not negotiated in the moment. It is secured only through respect for rules that exist because others did not have the chance to reconsider once consequences began to unfold. On September 18, 2020, the dry season light lay flat and unforgiving across a protected reserve in northern Botswana, where tawny grasslands gave way to sparse Mopani woodland and long sightlines offered the illusion of control. The morning air was cool, carrying the distant calls of birds and the low rustle of wind through grass. This was a landscape managed for conservation first and tourism second, a place where human access was permitted only under strict conditions designed to demonstrate safe coexistence with apex predators rather than proximity to them. A small group of international visitors assembled at a ranger outpost shortly after sunrise to begin a guided walking safari, an activity regulated more tightly than vehicle-based drives. Among them was a 34-year-old travel blogger from Germany, a self-employed digital creator whose work focused on immersive travel experiences. His following had grown steadily through images and short videos that placed viewers close to environments most people only saw from a distance. The walking safari, he believed, would provide authentic content that set his work apart, a visceral encounter that aligned with his professional motive to document the world from inside it. Before departure, the lead guide conducted a mandatory orientation delivered with the formality reserved for activities where error margins are narrow. The guide outlined strict safety guidelines that governed every step of the walk. Participants were instructed to maintain distance measured in meters from any wildlife encountered, to remain behind the armed guide at all times, and to move only when directed. If predators were sighted, the group was to stop immediately, retreat slowly if instructed, and avoid sudden movements or changes in posture. The rule to follow instructions immediately was emphasized repeatedly, framed not as authority, but as survival protocol. The guide explained that walking safaris differed fundamentally from vehicle safaris because the human profile was fully exposed. On foot, posture, spacing, and group cohesion determine how animals interpret intent. The orientation included a briefing on lions in the region, noting that prides often rest during the day but remain alert to movement within their territory. Participants acknowledged the explicit rules before setting out, spacing themselves in single file behind the guide and an armed ranger who walked at the rear. For the first hour, the walk unfolded without incident. The group moved at a measured pace, stopping to examine tracks and vegetation while the guide explained how predators used terrain to their advantage. The blogger filmed selectively, keeping his camera low and remaining within the formation. The absence of immediate danger fostered a sense of calm, and as the morning progressed, the rules began to feel procedural rather than urgent. This gradual complacency is a recurring factor in wildlife incidents. When early compliance produces no negative feedback, individuals may reassess the necessity of constraints, particularly when personal objectives compete with collective safety. Investigators later noted that the blogger appeared increasingly focused on capturing footage rather than on maintaining position, lagging slightly to adjust angles before closing the gap again. At approximately 10:20 a.m., the guide raised a hand and brought the group to a stop. Ahead, in an open patch of grass roughly 60 meters away, a pride of lions was resting. Several lionesses lay stretched out, partially shaded, while at least one adult male was visible farther back. No cubs were immediately apparent, but the configuration suggested a relaxed pride conserving energy. The guide quietly reiterated the rules, instructing everyone to remain still and maintain distance while he assessed wind direction and the animal's awareness. From an animal behavior standpoint, lions at rest are not disengaged. Wildlife authorities later explained that apex predators monitor their surroundings continuously, even when lying down. Their assessment relies on movement, spacing, and the perceived intent of other animals entering their range. A cohesive group that stops at a distance may be interpreted as non-threatening, while an individual advancing alone alters that calculation instantly. As the group remained stationary, the blogger shifted his position, stepping slightly to the side to improve his view. The distance and the clarity of the scene presented what he likely perceived as a rare opportunity. According to witness accounts, the guide signaled him to stop and gestured for him to remain behind the line. The blogger hesitated, then took several steps forward, reducing the distance to approximately 45 meters. This advance, though measured in only a few meters, constituted a clear violation of protocols. It placed him ahead of the guide and altered the group's formation. In investigative terms, this was the single decisive reckless decision, a fatal photo opportunity driven by proximity and professional ambition. The guide immediately instructed him to stop and retreat, but the movement had already changed the dynamic. The lions responded within seconds. One lioness lifted her head, orienting directly toward the advancing figure. Another rose to her feet. What followed was a rapid escalation, not prolonged or chaotic, but decisive. The pride interpreted the lone human advancing as a potential threat or challenge within their territory. The guide ordered the group to hold position and began preparing to intervene, but the distance closed faster than human reaction time allows. The blogger sustained fatal injuries and did not survive the encounter. The rest of the group remained where they were, following instructions immediately, minimizing further provocation. The armed ranger fired warning shots into the air to deter the lions, a standard measure intended to create auditory disturbance without targeting the animals. The pride withdrew after the initial engagement, retreating back into the grass. Within moments, the guide radioed for help, transmitting precise GPS coordinates to reserve headquarters. The ranger response was initiated immediately. A patrol vehicle reached the location within minutes, and medical responders attempted life-saving measures as soon as the area was secured. Given the severity of the injuries, an airlifted medical evacuation was requested, and a helicopter was dispatched from a regional base. Despite these efforts, the individual was pronounced deceased at the scene. The area was cordoned off, and the remaining visitors were escorted back to the outpost under ranger supervision. Crisis counselors were made available, and the walking safari program was suspended pending review. The lions involved were tracked but not destroyed, as their behavior fell within natural parameters. In the weeks that followed, authorities conducted a comprehensive investigation. Orientation materials, guide reports, radio logs, and GPS data were analyzed. The investigation determined that the safety briefing had been delivered clearly and that the guide had issued immediate and repeated instructions to stop. The blogger's decision to advance ahead of the group was identified as a direct violation of explicit rules. Authorities concluded that the incident resulted from human error and tourist error, not from guide negligence or animal abnormality. The final report emphasized that walking safaris require absolute discipline because the margin for correction is measured in seconds. Even small reductions in distance, when uncoordinated, can trigger defensive responses from apex predators. In its findings, the review panel contextualized the incident within broader wildlife safety principles. Whether observing a pride of lions with lionesses and cubs from a vehicle, maintaining distance from mountain gorillas led by a dominant silverback, or navigating waterways inhabited by a Nile crocodile functioning as an ambush predator, the pattern remains consistent. Animals respond to posture, proximity, and movement, not to intent or professional motive. The report noted that content creation has become an increasingly common driver of risk in wildlife tourism. While documentation itself is not prohibited, prioritizing imagery over protocol undermines the systems designed to keep both people and animals safe. Wildlife, the authorities stressed, is not a backdrop for content creation, but a living system governed by instinct. For the blogger's family and followers, the loss reframed a career built on exploration. His final moment was defined not by recklessness in character, but by a misjudgment of distance and consequence under conditions that felt controlled. It was a lesson learned too late, one that underscores the difference between access and entitlement in protected spaces. Walking safaris continue to operate in the reserve, but with additional emphasis on spacing and compliance, and with stricter limits on group composition. Rangers now reiterate that the privilege of walking among wildlife carries obligations that cannot be relaxed, even briefly. In wild landscapes, safety is not negotiated in real time. It is established in advance through strict safety guidelines, reinforced through orientation, and preserved only when explicit rules are followed without exception. The outcome in northern Botswana serves as a cautionary record that ignoring those rules leads to predictable, avoidable consequences, and that the cost of a single step forward can be irreversible. On March 6, 2021, morning mist clung to the upper canopy of a dense mountain forest reserve in East Africa, where towering fig trees and tangled undergrowth formed a living barrier between human visitors and one of the continent's most closely protected species. The forest was quiet in the way high-altitude ecosystems often are, the air cool and damp, the ground softened by years of leaf fall. This reserve was internationally known for its habituated mountain gorillas, animals accustomed to limited human presence under tightly regulated conditions that had been refined through decades of conservation practice. Among the visitors assembling at the ranger station that morning was Tomasz Lewin, a 47-year-old wildlife photographer from Poland. Tomasz had spent more than 20 years documenting animals across multiple continents, publishing in niche conservation journals, and maintaining a professional portfolio built on proximity and patience. He described himself as cautious but committed to authenticity, and he believed his experience set him apart from casual tourists. The gorilla trek represented, in his view, a culmination of that career, an opportunity to capture intimate images of a gorilla family led by a dominant silverback, images he hoped would define a new chapter in his work. Before the group entered the forest, rangers conducted a mandatory orientation, delivered with formal clarity and repeated emphasis.
Strict safety guidelines were outlined step by step. Visitors were instructed to maintain a minimum distance of 7 meters from the gorillas at all times, a threshold determined through behavioral research to minimize stress and prevent defensive reactions. Direct eye contact was prohibited, as it can be interpreted as a challenge. Sudden movements were discouraged, and guests were told to remain together, follow instructions immediately, and retreat slowly if directed. The rangers explained that even habituated gorillas remain wild animals, capable of rapid escalation when boundaries are crossed. The orientation also addressed the role of the silverback, the adult male who leads and protects the group. Rangers explained that the silverback's primary responsibility is the safety of his family, and that his warning behaviors, including vocalizations, chest beats, and short charges, are designed to deter perceived threats without physical contact. Ignoring these signals, the rangers emphasized, constitutes violated protocols and places both humans and animals at risk. Tomasz acknowledged the rules along with the rest of the group, adjusting his camera equipment and preparing for the trek. The hike into the forest took nearly an hour, moving along narrow trails cut into steep terrain. The group followed single file, stepping carefully over roots and damp ground. When the gorilla family was located, the guides brought everyone to a controlled stop. Ahead, partially obscured by foliage, several mountain gorillas moved slowly through the understory. The silverback was visible near the center of the group, his size and posture immediately commanding attention. The distance between visitors and animals was measured at approximately 10 meters, consistent with the guidelines. For the first several minutes, the interaction unfolded as intended. Tomasz photographed from behind the guide, keeping his movement slow and deliberate. The gorillas appeared calm, feeding and shifting positions without signs of agitation. The silverback occasionally glanced toward the group, then returned his attention to the family. In these moments, the system appeared to wake, reinforcing the sense that adherence to rules allowed safe observation. Over time, however, Tomasz began to reposition himself incrementally. He stepped slightly to one side to clear branches from his frame, then leaned forward to reduce the amount of foliage between his lens and the silverback. Each adjustment reduced the distance by small margins, movements measured in centimeters rather than meters. To an experienced photographer, these shifts may have felt negligible. To an animal assessing proximity, they were not. This gradual complacency, investigators later noted, often emerges when individuals with prior experience believe they can interpret animal behavior independently of established protocol. Tomaš's confidence in reading wildlife cues appeared to override the explicit rules delivered during orientation. Rangers gestured for him to hold position, reminding the group to maintain distance. Tomaš complied briefly, then edged forward again, intent on securing what he believed would be a defining image. From an animal behavior perspective, mountain gorillas are highly perceptive to changes in posture and spacing. Authorities later explained that a human closing distance, particularly toward the dominant silverback, can be interpreted as a direct challenge. The silverback's earlier glances and subtle shift were consistent with heightened awareness, precursors to warning displays intended to re-establish boundaries. As Tomaš moved closer, the distance narrowed to approximately 6 meters, crossing the threshold set by safety guidelines. The silverback responded immediately. He rose, vocalized, and advanced in a short, rapid charge designed to force retreat. Rangers shouted instructions for everyone to remain still and avert their gaze. The escalation unfolded in seconds, leaving little opportunity for corrective action. Tomaš sustained severe injuries during the encounter. The Rangers intervened as quickly as conditions allowed, using their training to deter further engagement and draw the gorillas back. The family retreated deeper into the forest once the immediate threat was neutralized. Other visitors, who had followed instructions immediately, were physically unharmed. Within moments, the lead ranger radioed for help, transmitting precise GPS coordinates to the reserve's emergency response team. A ranger response unit reached the site within minutes, carrying medical supplies and a stretcher adapted for steep terrain. Medical responders attempted life-saving measures on site, stabilizing Tomaš for evacuation. Given the severity of his condition, an airlifted medical evacuation was requested, and a helicopter was dispatched from a regional hub. Tomaš was airlifted to a hospital equipped to handle trauma cases. Despite intensive treatment, he died several days later from complications related to the injury sustained. The reserve suspended guerrilla trekking activities temporarily, both out of respect and to allow for a thorough review of procedures. Authorities initiated a formal investigation immediately. Orientation records, ranger statements, and photographs taken during the trek were examined. The investigation determined that the safety briefing had been delivered in full and that the guides had issued timely warnings as Tomaš advanced. The silverback behavior was assessed as a natural defensive response consistent with established knowledge of mountain gorilla behavior. The final report concluded that Tomaš's death resulted from deliberate violations of protocol. Authorities concluded that human error, specifically the decision to close distance despite clear rules and warning behaviors, was the sole contributing factor. No changes were made to the gorilla group's management, and no animals were harmed as part of the response. In contextualizing the incident, the report drew parallels to other wildlife encounters governed by similar principles. Whether observing a pride of lions with lionesses and cubs from a vehicle, navigating a river inhabited by a Nile crocodile functioning as an ambush predator, or trekking through forests to view mountain gorillas led by a silverback, the underlying rule remains the same. Distance and discipline dictate safety. Animals respond to movement and proximity, not to intent, experience, or professional motivation. The investigation emphasized that habituation does not equate to domestication. Mountain gorillas tolerate human presence only within narrowly defined limits. When those limits are exceeded, the animals enforce their boundaries with speed and certainty. The systems designed to prevent harm rely on collective compliance. A single individual's actions can dismantle that structure in seconds. For Tomaš's colleagues and family, the loss carried a particular weight. His career had been built on respect for wildlife, yet his final moment reflected how even experienced individuals can misjudge risk under conditions that feel controlled. It was a lesson learned too late, one that underscored the difference between access and entitlement in protected spaces. In the months following the incident, the reserve updated its orientation materials, adding clearer visual demonstrations of distance and reinforcing the consequences of violated protocols. Rangers reported spending additional time ensuring visitors understood that photography, however valuable, must always remain secondary to safety. Wild animals do not adapt their instincts to accommodate human goals. Apex predators, whether they walk on four legs across open savanna or move silently through mountain forest, operate according to evolutionary imperatives that cannot be negotiated in the moment. Strict safety guidelines exist not to limit experience, but to preserve it. The outcome in that forest in March 2021 serves as a cautionary record. In environments where consequences unfold in seconds, following instructions immediately is not optional. It is the only reliable safeguard. When distance is respected, coexistence is possible. When it is not, the escalation is predictable, avoidable, and often irreversible.